Центральный Казахстана, они информируют состоявшихся в Киеве беседе председателем партии значит СССР гарантии внешнеторговой Франции, Алтая.
If a government wants to control the information available to its citizens and limit exposure to ideas that contradict official state propaganda, it can either counter or stop these subversive streams of information, or disrupt them. The Cold War between Russia and the United States was much more than a potentially devastating lock of horns between two superpowers involving nuclear missiles. It was also a battle of words, played out on both sides for the world to hear, over mediums that included shortwave radio. International broadcasters such as the Voice of America and Radio Moscow, to name just two, using powerful transmitters and multiple frequencies, broadcast their message to millions of people around the world. This is the story of how the Soviet Union, in an attempt to control what its citizens were being told, set up what might have been the biggest and greatest radio jamming network ever to exist. The effectiveness of the vast wall of jamming created by the Soviet Union and its allied states was truly significant, and it targeted many huge broadcasters. At its height, 14 out of the 16 Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty's Eastern European language services were being jammed. During the Cold War, Radio Free Europe was broadcast to Soviet satellite states, including the Baltic states, and Radio Liberty targeted the Soviet Union. Radio Free Europe was founded as an anti-communist propaganda source in 1949 by the National Committee for a Free Europe, and Radio Liberty was founded 2 years later. The two organisations merged in 1976. Communist governments frequently sent agents to infiltrate RFE's headquarters, and the KGB naturally jammed its broadcasts. Another big target was the Voice of America, the largest and oldest of the US-funded international broadcasters, who ramped up its operations during the Cold War. In 1947, it started broadcasting to the Soviet citizens in Russia under the pretext of countering, quote, more harmful instances of Soviet propaganda directed against American leaders and policies on the part of the internal Soviet Russian language media. The Soviet Union responded by initiating electronic jamming of Voice of America broadcasts on April 24, 1949, and as the years went by, 12 of the 21 languages of the Voice of America were targeted by jammers. 5 of the 11 Eastern European and Soviet language services of the German international broadcaster Deutsche Welle were also jammed, and the UK's BBC suffered jamming on 2 of its 12 Eastern European language services. In as early as 1931, with radio being one of the main forms of mass media and a real headache that could cross borders without limitation, the USSR began jamming Romanian radio, and by 1940 it began jamming Lithuanian language broadcasts of Vatican Radio. I should point out that jamming of international broadcasters by enemy states began as far back as the 1920s. The Soviet jamming system was created by the RU-2 department of the All-Union Ministry of Communications of the USSR, and it was responsible for the maintenance and further development of all types of communications in general use and technical means of radio and television broadcasting. From February 1948, the Soviet Union began building and expanding its radio jamming capabilities to prevent its citizens from listening to political broadcasts. The main targets of jamming at this time were the British Broadcasting Corporation, or BBC, and the Voice of America. By the late 1940s, around 200 jamming stations were in use, running between 3 and 4 megawatts of power combined. By the early 1950s, however, this had expanded to around 1,700 transmitters. There were 2 types of jamming facilities: short range, also known as ground wave, which were low power sites covering big cities using smaller wire antennas, or long range or ionospheric and skywave jammers using directional antennas. An example of a short range station is object number 603 in Kaunas, Lithuania. Local jamming transmitters output anywhere between 1 and 20 kilowatts, but they were usually 5 kilowatts, and each station had up to 20 units, with most having 15. They fed large wire dipoles suspended vertically or at a 45-degree angle. These covered a small area of around 30 kilometers, and by 1986 they were situated in 81 cities across the Soviet Union. 13 long-distance jamming facilities with over 100 high-power transmitters were used for blocking out large areas of territory by transmitting interference into specific regions at anywhere between 50 and 500 kilowatts. Unlike local jammers, these covered areas ranging between 500 and 3,000 kilometers and used large curtain arrays. Moscow Radio Center 13 was an example of a large jamming facility. The smaller local jammers were given names like Object Number 600, and large jammers were given names like Object Number 800. Every jammer used an identification code or call sign for its transmitters, which was made up of 2 letters or sometimes a letter and a number. The call signs of the jammer were transmitted twice per minute to enable the identification of each station. Antenna masts were painted in yellow and black until 1975 to prevent enemy aircraft from identifying them in the natural background. From around 1975 onwards, all of the radio and TV towers, including jammers, were painted in red and white. Direction-finding attempts by the US and UK placed transmitters generally in the western regions of the USSR, near Moscow, Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, Kiev, in the Southern Republic of Kazakhstan, and in the eastern part of the Russian Federation, near Novosibirsk and Khabarovsk. It was believed that the USSR may have been spending at least $800 million annually on the construction and operation of its jamming stations. The Soviet Union and its Eastern European ally states employed different types of radio jamming. Jamming initially consisted of superimposed random speech, which mimicked co-channel interference, but due to the apparent ineffectiveness of this method, other techniques were used to block the transmissions of target stations. At least 10 known methods were used. A wide block of synthesized noise was used to block out the anti-Soviet stations that were deemed the biggest threat. These jammers targeted stations such as Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, Voice of Israel, and the Albanian Radio Tirana. During the 1960s, medium-wave transmitters were tuned on 465 kHz intermediate frequencies, paralysing nearly all of the neighbouring radio receivers, blocking out everything. On the 3rd of August 1964, a Russian Radio Mayak program was sent in FM over the top of stations such as the Voice of America, the BBC, Deutsche Welle and Radio Beijing. In 1976, a method of speech synthesis was used that sounded like normal radio traffic. It consisted of the voices of Russian male and female announcers. Between 1971 and 1980, the Polish-language programs of Radio Free Europe were jammed with music, sent from transmitters in Warsaw, Poland. The Polish service of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty was jammed with music from 1971 until 1980. A difficult-to-identify jamming method was to broadcast a regular domestic or foreign service program on the frequency of the target station. East Germany sent its domestic radio programs using medium-wave transmitters tuned a few hertz away from the RIAS frequencies. RIAS stands for Rundfunk in Amerikanischen Sektor. It was a radio and television station in the American sector of Berlin during the Cold War. Jammers similar in nature to warble jammers were used to jam Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. They were even picked up by the circuits of domestic cassette and record players. There were several occasions reported when jamming made use of non-modulated carrier waves, although this technique was largely ineffective. Just before the end of the jamming era, the programs of a jammed station were received and the audio was fed by cable to a circuit which changed its phase by 180 degrees. It was then simultaneously sent back to the jamming transmitter in an attempt to block the target station. Jamming was coordinated using monitoring sites known as jamming control and correction posts, situated a few miles away from the transmitter sites. This was the radio monitoring station for the small-scale local radio jammer, Object Number 600. It was located at this house in the city of Vilnius in Lithuania. There's no clue today as to its former use. Operators at the listening post scanned the bands, and it was on their discretion whether jamming would start. It was usually based on factors such as the signal strength of the target. They issued orders by a dedicated phone line to the transmitter site, which included the frequency, times, target name, and program language. The transmitters in some cases could be switched on remotely from the receive site. The main response of Western broadcasters to the massive increase in Soviet jamming was to saturate the airwaves with more frequencies. Call Israel commenced an experiment on its Russian language broadcasts by adding 12 new frequencies to their regular 5. Radio Liberty used as many as 19 frequencies, and there were plans to reach 40 to complicate the jamming efforts. During periods where political tensions were lower or there were changes in the political landscape, the USSR would stop jamming certain stations. Jamming of British and American stations stopped for 6 months in 1956 during Nikita Khrushchev's visit to the UK and the Hungarian crisis. It also ceased in September of 1959 during Khrushchev's visit to the US, and early 1960 when an American U-2 spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Soviet airspace. It's been alleged that there was no jamming of any targets excluding Radio Free Europe between 1963 and 1968 and 1973 to 1980, although I can't find any information to support this claim. On the evening of the 29th of November 1988, well into the decline of the Soviet Union, jamming ceased on all foreign radio stations, allowing Soviet citizens, for the first time since a brief period in the 1960s, to have unrestricted access to news sources beyond Communist Party control. 1,600 transmitters were finally switched off across 120 jamming centres that spanned the USSR, Czechoslovakia and Bulgaria. When the Soviet Union collapsed, some jammers were left derelict or dismantled, others were converted into broadcast stations. Many don't exist at all today, and others lie within some of Europe's biggest cities, repurposed as cell towers and television and radio broadcast sites.
Они информируют состоявшийся в Киеве беседе председателя партии СССР новостных гарантий, что внешнеторговый транспорт, Алтая могли бы возглавлять французскую делегацию на 65-м Беларуси, действующий с